Never gone live before. This is my first time.
Let's see. I think it might be working now. Let's see. It says it's streaming. Hello. Yeah, it does. How exciting. Hey everyone, my name is Charlie Bonner with Move Texas. This is Move University. We're talking Census 101 today. Thank you so much for joining us as part of the Move University series, Social Justice for Social Distancing. Hope everyone is doing well, washing their hands and staying sane at home. I am joined today with our friend Katie Martin Lightfoot, the Census Community Engagement Coordinator for the Center for Public Policy Priorities, better known as CPPP. Katie, how are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Just, yeah, doing census work while we're dealing with the pandemic. So
I don't envy you. I don't envy you at all. But we're so grateful that you could make time for us today. I know so many people have questions about the census, especially young people. That's really what Move is all about, is empowering young people with the information they need to be better citizens and better members of our community. And, you know, it's been 10 years since the last census. I know that. It's every 10 years. So I would have been 14. I did not fill it out. Sadly, my family did not let me fill out the census at 14, which was probably a good call. So we have lots of questions. We have lots of questions, and I think maybe we should just dive right in. But first of all, I think we need to start. Are you doing well at home? Are you self-isolating, self-quarantining, social distancing?
I am all of the above. I think I've been social distancing since last Sunday. And so last week was very interesting, trying to figure out what life looks like now. And then also in terms of the Census Bureau and what operations looked like. And so there's been a lot going on, just trying to figure out what's going on professionally, but also personally, and my self-care and trying to have a routine. But my cats have been loving it. They're very excited that their mom is home all the time and they get to sit out on the patio in the sunshine. So we got some misses and wins over here.
I love that. Some bright spots. I think the animals are enjoying everything. Well, let's get into it then. So just for folks who don't know, what is the census? You know, it doesn't happen very often, so some people might not even know what it is.
Yeah, so you are 100% right, Charlie. The census happens every 10 years. It's actually in our Constitution, and we've been doing this since 1790. So every 10 years, the census counts every single person living in the United States once and only once and in the right place.
Interesting. So once and only once. I think in the right place. I think that's an interesting note, especially for young people. Do you have any specifics on what in the right place might mean?
Yeah, so in the right place. So again, we want to make sure that we're counting folks where they are spending most of their time. And so now I know it's really confusing since a lot of college students are going back home or maybe not necessarily living in their college towns anymore. And so when we specifically think about counting college students or young folks who are a little bit more mobile, specifically for our college students, university students, grad students, whatever you might be, you're going to count yourself where you go to school because that's typically where you spend the most time. But if you are so if you're like potentially going to be like moving to a new location, you would count yourself where you are on April 1st. And so really the way that the Census Bureau figures out where they should count you is where you're staying April 1st. I know for a lot of you, it might not be necessarily where you spend the majority of your time. And so kind of the other side of that is think about where you spend the most nights. So where you lay your head to rest at night.
Yeah. And I think it's super important when we talk about, and we'll get into this more, but things that the census impacts like redistricting. You know, we don't want students to get undercounted because then they get redistricted all crazy. And then you have places like Austin where UT students live in 4 different congressional districts, you know, and so there can be big ramifications for that. How do folks fill out the census? I received mine in the mail just the other day while I've been here at home and I need to fill it out still. But what do people do? They should be looking out for their mailboxes.
Yes. So starting last week on March 12th, and I believe you probably should have received it by now. So make sure you check your mailboxes if you haven't yet. You would have received an invitation to fill out the census online. So something really exciting about the 2020 census that has never been done before is that it's actually online. So we're not just doing snail mail, mailing those paper questionnaires back in. And so in that envelope, there is an invitation with a unique code on there to fill out the census. So you just go to 2020census.gov, go to the website, click, put in that code on your form, and then start filling it out. It's 9 easy questions. Even though that invitations have been sent out, we know that maybe the census might not be at the top of your priority list, which is understandable. So the Census Bureau will send lots and lots of reminders. So be expecting lots of follow-up communications coming from the Census Bureau. I believe it's 5 in total. If you were awesome and got your invitation and you filled it out, do know that you still will get that second reminder because that has already been kind of in the system. But one thing I want to point out is that it is online this year, which you can do it on your smartphone, your laptop, tablet, whatever. But if you're not comfortable with that, you can still fill it out via the phone. So you can actually call the Census Bureau and have someone fill it out with you. And then if you're just like, nope, I want the paper questionnaire, they'll actually mail those out in April. So there's 3 ways to self-respond to the census, which is great. And each of those 3 ways, you're not having to interact with any census taker. No one's going to be coming to your door during this point in time. So again, the self-response window is so important because 1, it's important to fill out the census, but 2, you're not having to interact with an enumerator, is what they're called, or a door knocker coming to your door later in the summer. So
yeah, that's great. That's a great tip. So people, if you want to avoid that door knocker, that in-person contact, which is so important right now, just do it yourself, do it online. I think that's a great tip. And make sure if you're watching right now, we're happy to take questions. We see lots of people work, and somebody said that it's working, so that's good. Thank you for that positive feedback. You love to see it. But we're seeing some Nuges in here, Raven, Drew, Alex. So great to see all of y'all. So make sure you submit your questions. We also have some from Twitter that we've gotten and from Instagram. So we're doing lots of things, and I'll fill some of those out as we go. So we got how do we fill it out, but I guess there's a kind of a more meta question here of why is it even important? Why do we need one? It's required by law, I guess, but why should folks fill it out?
yeah, that's a great question. So when we think about the census, we can break it into 3 different categories. And so I'm going to start with political representation first. And so the census counts everyone, and like I said, in the right place, and once and only once. And so with that information, it informs our representation in Congress. So in Texas, if we have an accurate count, we could potentially gain up to 2 to 3 new seats for our state, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
It could also affect our electoral college votes as well. And then Charlie, as you said, redistricting, we know that's a really hot topic. And again, the census data is used to draw those redistricting lines. And so it's really important to make sure that we have accurate data so everyone is counted in our state and there's good representation within our district so that those are fair and equal. And that is going from like the top level, like federal level, all the way down to our local elections like school boards.
Yeah, I think that's super critical. And we know that gerrymandering, which happens after the census, where they kind of redraw the lines, can really affect how people are represented and how they feel like their voices are being heard. So this is that first step to making sure that our communities are counted and that we can have that correct representation. So I think that's important. We do have a good question from Emily. So thank you, Emily. Do you have to have that code to fill out your census form, that code you talked about that mailed to you?
Yeah, that is a great question. And no, you actually do not have to have that code to fill out the census. And so I was a census nerd, and literally the night before Eastern time, I like hopped on the website because I wanted to fill out the form. So I didn't actually have my envelope in the mail yet, my invitation, but all you need is your address. And something else I want to point out, maybe you don't have like a regular street address like 123 Apple Lane. If you have a rural route address, you can still put that in, fill out the census. But also if you or someone you know is experiencing homelessness, you can still respond to the census. And it's really great because there's just a little checkbox that you would click on the form itself. And you can actually say like, I'm in this city. This is the zip code that I tend to hang out in. And then you can actually just put an intersection that you might stay at. And so the census, again, is really trying to make sure they count everyone and making it as accessible as possible.
That's awesome. In folks who are experiencing homelessness, that's considered one of those hard to reach populations, right? And so what kind of efforts go into, I think, the the question of those experiencing homelessness for this is really interesting, just as like the process for this. So how does that kind of work outside of the self-responding? Are folks going out into the community to see who needs to be counted and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And things look a lot differently now than we were planning on them to look back in the fall. And so when we think about specific populations, the census actually does a group enumeration. And essentially what that means is if people are in group quarters, they'll count them at that place. So if you think about a homeless shelter or even a college dorm, a nursing facility, a nursing home facility, those types of places, the Census Bureau would actually work with folks on site to make sure that those people are counted. And so again, I think this is really important for our college university students, is because if you were living in a dorm, your dorm is going to make sure that you're counted. But if you're in off-campus housing, then that's up for you. Then it's your responsibility to make sure that you're responding to the census form. But for certain folks, it looks a little bit different, especially for folks that are experiencing homelessness. And so originally the Census Bureau had plans for operations to actually be going out to soup kitchens, walking the streets, or places where people experiencing homelessness frequent. So again, that looks a little bit differently now with COVID-19. And so those operations have actually been pushed back, but there still is definitely a desire and need to make sure that everyone is counted.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's great. A couple of questions coming in right now also, I think, that relate to that dorm question. What do we do if we live with roommates? Do we each fill it out, or does someone submit it together, or how might that work for folks, college students living in a dorm?
Yeah, so specifically, if you are living in a dorm or you were living in your dorm, your university, the residential people, they're in charge of making sure that count happens. But let's say you live off campus and you have 4 roommates. And so even though you might not be related by blood or you're in a relationship with any of them, you are still considered a household and you'll respond. So it doesn't matter if you love your roommate, hate your roommate, you're in the household, y'all are going to be responding on that same census questionnaire. And so when you actually look at the form, it will ask for person 1. So if you are the lucky person to be filling out the census form, you would start filling out the form. And then everyone else in your household, there's actually a relationship question. So you can put like, I'm married to this person, or this person is my brother, or this person is my roommate. And so if I'm filling out the form, I would put like my name. And then if Charlie was my roommate, I would list him as person number 2. And I would just check off that he was my roommate. So even if you're not necessarily like a family, whoever's living in that household gets counted on that one census form.
Your makeshift family. Hopefully my roommate's watching that. Did you hear that? This is a family. And I'm going to make her fill out the census. But what happens? So that's how folks are getting counted, which I think is super important, and everyone should go fill it out after this. But how is that info used after the fact? So we know that, redistricting, but where does it all go?
Yeah, so with that census data, the Census Bureau sends it off to the president. And one thing that's really important about that data is federal funding. And so the tax dollars that we send up to DC often come back to our state based off of our census numbers. Okay. And so this is money going into our healthcare system, thinking about Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, into our schools, like our school lunches, Title I funding, into our community health clinics, our fire departments, literally, like when you think about some of those larger federal programs, a lot of that funding is based off of census data. And so again, it's really important to make sure that we have an accurate count of folks in our state. For example, if there's a lot of a group that's a lot of times undercounted are 0 to 4-year-olds. And so you're like, well, they can't fill out the form. This is true. But when their parents or guardians fill out the form, they'll actually include their school age children, but they'll forget to include their newborn or their 2-year-old. And so again, it's really important to make sure we're including those kids on there, because when we think about funding for Head Start, our funding for school, we need to make sure that they're being counted for the next 10 years. An example that I heard somewhat recently, there was a brand new, beautiful high school that was in the process of being built in Dallas, and they were using the 2010 census data and projections to build that school. And when the school was built, they had the numbers from the census weren't completely accurate, and so students were already in portables. And so again, that information is really important. Going back to the funding issue, in Texas, if we have a 1% undercount in our state, we will lose $300 million per year for the next 10 years. So again, that's money coming
Wow.
directly. Yeah, that's money coming out of our communities that we need to make sure that we are thriving and living our best lives, and that our communities are safe and healthy and well educated. So again, really, really important to make sure that we submit those census forms.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. Another great question, I think we might have touched on it a little bit, so we can circle back though. But Juan is asking that he lived in a dorm and was kicked out because of the campus closures, like so many students across the country right now. He's couch surfing right now, but want to make sure that he and his friends get counted. They're living in that dorm. Any advice to them?
Yeah, so great question. So right now, the Census Bureau is working with higher education institutions to make sure that that count is happening. I know a lot of students are in your same place to where they were kicked out of their dorm style housing. So again, if you were in a dorm at your university, those housing administrators should have been in contact talking with the Census Bureau to make sure that y'all are counted. And so I'm so sorry that you are in this situation right now and you're not crowd surfing. You're not at a concert because you're socially isolating. But in terms of couch surfing, you should be, your university or college should make sure that you're counted in that dorm.
Awesome. Thank you. Also, a question on kind of the changes that we're seeing from Kristen. Has the deadline to fill out the census itself, has that changed? Or has the timeline changed at all because of COVID-19?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And it actually did get pushed back 2 weeks. And so the original timeline for the census, the end date was going to be July 31st. And now that deadline has been pushed 2 weeks after that. And I'm going to look at my calendar and let you know what that date is, because I don't have it off the top of my head. It's a new number. It's a new date. Okay, what's 2 weeks after? So it's looking like August 14th, and I will make sure I confirm that. And this is really interesting to think about because, I mean, the census starts doing planning for they're already working on the 2030 questionnaire to just show you how far in advance they do planning. And so with this, again, when it comes to redistricting and those hearings that are coming up, it's important to make sure that this accurate information is being sent so that those hearings can go well. And so we really don't want the census deadline to be pushed back. It might seem like common sense, like, oh, we should push it back, it's not that important. Really important to make sure that we get that data into folks' hands so they can make good decisions when it comes to redistricting.
Yeah, I think that really emphasizes how important it is for people to do it on their own without the enumerators, because that part is where things might be able to get tricky, but we don't necessarily need that, right? We can do this all on our own. We can be proactive about it. So we talked about what happens when people are unaccounted for. You said there's that huge number of even 1% gets undercounted. What is the state doing to make sure that we're not undercounted? Are they investing? This is a setup question. Are they investing in the census to make sure we're not undercounted?
So that is a great question. So during the 2019 legislative session, there was legislation proposed to create a complete count committee. And basically what a complete count committee is when you bring together folks from different sectors, leaders from different sectors, organizers from different sectors, and you put together a get out the count or outreach plan to make sure that everyone in your community, in your city, in your state is counted. And a lot of times when it comes to census outreach, there's also lots of money associated with that to make sure that we're paying the people who are doing this work, but also when we think about marketing and materials and those types of things. So for example, the state of California, I'm sure it's surpassed this by now, but they've set aside $187 million to make sure everyone in the state of California is counted. So think about Texas, we're big, we're awesome. Sure, we organized something. I'm sure we set aside funding. The state of Texas did not do anything. Their legislation did not pass. There is no state-sponsored complete count committee, nor is there any funding going towards census outreach efforts in our state. And so with that, two things, one thing emerged from that, but there was already something happening across our state. And so I want to highlight the local efforts that our cities and counties have been doing across Texas. Like I said, a complete count committee, or a CCC, is this group of leaders who are coming together to get out the count. And across our state, there are really, really strong, robust efforts happening at the local level to make sure folks are counted. But again, this work is really expensive and there's not a lot of funding out there for it. And so they are strong and they're involved, but again, it probably could have been more, like as a state as a whole, we could have been more robust.
Yeah.
In addition to that, my organization, CPPP, joined forces with the Communities Foundations of Texas up in Dallas, and we created Texas Counts. And this was in response to not having that state-sponsored effort. And so we have brought folks together across the state from all different sectors, thinking of grass tops to grassroots, and just engaging folks and get off the count efforts, and kind of know how to really engage in this work. So check us out at texascounts.org.
That's amazing. We're so grateful for you picking up the ball from the state.
We're trying.
We appreciate it. We really appreciate it. Another good question coming into here. If my parents fill out the census form and count me as a member, should I also fill it out for my apartment? Another good question for folks that are in college right now.
Yeah, great question. So technically your parents shouldn't count you on the census form. You should be counted by your household in college. So let's say your parents already submitted your form, but you want to make sure that you and your roommates are counted back at college. The Census Bureau, they are so smart, and I don't know the mechanics behind it, but they have a really robust deduplicating process. So even if your parents ended up counting you at your home, and then you counted yourself where you go to school, it's okay. They'll figure it out in the end. At least we know you're getting counted. But just a reminder, I know this time is really confusing, especially with schools getting canceled and moving to remote and getting kicked out of dorms. Yeah. But again, if you were an off-campus housing at school, go ahead and fill out that census form for that household. Your parents will not need to count you on the census.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Another great question coming in. How important is it for us to be very precise in reporting our race and ethnicity? I know this is one of the questions that might be tripping up some folks as they're trying to figure this out.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to start with is when you look at the census form, it's not very inclusive. It's the questions could be stronger or more inclusive, but this is the form that we have right now. And so one thing that's really important about this is making sure that you're self-identifying on that form, so that the Census Bureau knows, like, hey, like, I am part of this race and I count, or this is how I identify and I count. And so I want to talk specifically about 3 questions on the census. And one is the sex question. It's a binary question that's male or female. One thing I want to say is, I know that's not inclusive, but between those 2 options that you do have, you're going to have to choose one. And so feel however you identify. And again, I know it's not inclusive, but if you can fit into one of those categories, highly encourage you to self-identify for that question. In terms of race and ethnicity.
Question back on the sex question just before we move on. Non-binary folks who might not be comfortable choosing one or the other, do you skip that question, or do you have to fill out all the questions to be able to submit the form? How do folks navigate that? Because I know that can be tricky.
Yeah, and again, not the perfect questionnaire by any means. If you're filling out the form online, before you can move to the next screen, they're going to make you choose one, unfortunately. And it's those only 2 options. If you were filling it out over the phone, technically you could say, like, I don't want to respond. But kind of the not so great thing about that is the Census Bureau is going to identify that for you. And so without kind of any knowledge of you, I mean, maybe they'll look at some data, but they're just going to choose one for you. Same on the paper questionnaire. Like, if you leave that blank, chances are they're just going to fill that in for you as well.
So best to self-identify, so you get to make that decision yourself rather than a census taker.
Yes.
Got it.
And then very good question. And then when it comes to the race and ethnicity, so the first question it's going to ask you is if you are Latino, Hispanic, or Spanish origin. And so on that question, I'm trying to remember it. So it might say, like, yes, and it says, like, yes, I'm Cuban, yes, I'm Mexican. There's a couple of different options. And then there's also just like a yes, where you can also fill in how you identify. One thing I want to say, and I'm pretty sure that the online form forces you to do this as well, in those blanks is a really good opportunity, one, for identifying yourself, but also for advocacy. And so, for example, when we leave the ethnicity question and we go to race, again, it's white, black. When you look at the section for different Asian groups, it's nice because you'll actually see some that are listed out. And that's an example of how advocacy on the form actually worked, because populations were like, hey, we want to make sure that we're counted accurately. And so there's actually blanks for that. On that form, so if you identify in the MENA group, so Middle Eastern, North African, you're counted, you have to check the white box. And that's how that since, again, not the perfect questionnaire, but again, that point of self-identity where that there's a box right under that, and that's where you get to write, I'm Egyptian, or I'm from Ethiopia, or however you identify in that box. It's also nice because you can check off multiple. So if you are biracial or multiracial, you can make sure, again, that you're identifying in the way that however you self-identify. And again, this is just really important for that advocacy aspect, because maybe you are part of a MENA population and you want to make sure that you see that on the 2030 census. And so again, really important to make sure you're identifying your ethnicity, whether you're Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish, and then what your race is as well.
I think that's great. And that's super useful information. And a lot of folks don't know that. So if you're watching this and you learn something, make sure that you're telling your friends and neighbors about that so we can get that information out. Another great question. Thank you everyone for asking such great questions. How do organizations like yours make sure that people in rural and incorporated areas, or Kolonai, I cannot ever say this word, I'm so sorry.
I know.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
In our rural communities, places that are just hard to count geographically. Is there anything those communities members can do to make sure that they're better represented?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And one of the reasons why Texas Counts was created in the first place, because we know that our larger metropolitan areas, thinking Dallas County, Harris County, Travis County, El Paso County, they have a lot of people power, but they also have more resources than maybe someone out in East Texas or along the border might have. One thing I want to point out is that there are hard to count populations. And so they can be like specific groups of people, but also we can think about it geographically as well. So 25% of Texans actually live in a hard to count community. So 1 in 4 Texans is hard to count, which is a lot. And when there's actually a map that shows where these hard to count populations are, and obviously in our more dense spaces, like again, Harris County, Dallas County, we'll have a lot of folks that are hard to count just because there's a lot of people there. But you can also see along the border, there's a lot of hard to count populations as well. And so a couple of things I want to say about counting folks in those spaces. And so there have been funding opportunities through Texas Counts and through other foundations who are working with folks who are on the ground in these spaces to make sure, one, that they have the resources they need to get out the count, but they're also receiving some technical assistance. Yeah. So a really good example of this out in East Texas, in Lufkin, Texas, it's called the Deep East Texas Council of Governments, or the DECCOG is a group I've been working with. So they got funding to do census outreach in that area. And then I've actually gone to go up there a couple times to work with folks who are actually on the ground doing census work. And one thing that's really important about the census outreach is that yes, there's a lot of information and resources and materials about their promoting the census, but at the end of the day, someone's more likely to listen to your neighbor or your faith leader or your doctor, as opposed to like someone like me coming in. And so with that, it's really empowering folks to feel comfortable and confident talking about the census, and then using their trusted voice to go out and spread the information about the census. And so just on the ground, folks have been really creative in thinking about what work makes the most sense for their community. Another group I want to highlight down along the border is Hidalgo County. If you check out their social media, they are killing it. They've been killing it for a long time in terms of census outreach and the materials they've been sharing out. And again, Hidalgo County was intercounted in 2010, and they recognize that. And so they really have been pushing to make sure that their communities get counted. And so there's been a lot of work just in the outreach space, but the Census Bureau itself also knows that these areas are harder to count, and trying to work with folks on the ground to make sure that everyone gets counted.
That's awesome. And it's so interesting because that peer-to-peer model, like that's community organizing, right? That's what MOVE was founded on to begin with. That's how we get out the vote. We talk to our friends and we talk to our neighbors, and we're involved in the census count too. We're talking to all sorts of young people right now because that's how we know it works best, when our friends and neighbors and peers all talk to each other. So it's interesting to see how that plays out across the state and communities. I think another interesting kind of question, something that we heard a lot about. Do you have to be a citizen to fill out the census? Are we only counting certain folks here? Are we counting everyone? And if folks aren't citizens, they might be undocumented folks. Are they safe to fill out the census?
That's a great question. So short answer is, if you are living in the United States, you deserve to fill out that census form and be counted in our country, in your community. And so whether you're a citizen, non-citizen, documented, undocumented, everybody counts on the census. And again, this is really important to make sure that we're counting all folks. So again, that representation is there. With that as well, I talked about hard to count populations or undercounted populations, and people who are undocumented or immigrants, people of color, folks that might be facing language barriers are oftentimes undercounted on the census. So again, it's really important for us to be educating folks about the importance of the census, but also the fact that it's safe to fill out. And so with the Census Bureau, again, they've been doing this since 1790. This entity has been operating and using people's data for the different purposes like political organization, funding, all that good stuff. And so one thing that I want to say is that in terms of your data going to the census, it's confidential. And so the Census Bureau cannot share your information with anybody. And currently there are no protections that are currently in place that could go away. And so anyone that works for the Census Bureau, they actually take an oath. It's protected under Title 13. And so with that oath, they're promising not to share anyone's data. And so with that, if they do, there's prison time involved up to 5 years, and they have to pay a $250,000 fine. And anyone that I've talked to within the Census Bureau is very much like, they take that oath extremely seriously because they want to respect the trust that this organization or this entity has built. So again, they are not going to be sharing this information with ICE, with the FBI. If there are multiple parties living in a household, they're not going to tell your landlord. They're not going to tell local law enforcement. It can't even be used in like a court proceeding. So again, this information is only used for statistical purposes. And it's really important, again, to make sure that populations that were undercounted in the past are counted on this 2020 census, so we have that representation.
Awesome. I think that's definitely another one of those things that we need to be making sure that we're telling our friends and neighbors, right? That's a common misconception. It was intentionally a common misconception. So we have to make sure that we're having that conversation all the time. So thank you so much for that one. How are we doing so far? How is Texas comparing to the rest of the country? Are we filling it out while we're all at home? Seems like a great time. How are we doing so far?
So I actually just pulled these numbers off the Census Bureau's website. So the national response rate across our country is 21%, which is pretty good for it being a little over a week that it's been live and available for people to fill it out. And in Texas, we're at 17.5%. So we are currently behind. I know that number is going up, but again, one thing I want to mention about census outreach is, yes, we can do digital organizing and connect with folks through social media, newsletters, those types of things, but a lot of that is that peer-to-peer connection and interaction. And so a lot of people were planning on having in-person events where they were going to get people that might not necessarily be connected on social media to fill out the form. But that can't happen right now. And so just for folks who are in the get out the count world, we're trying to re-strategize and think about how we can reach people. And so although our number is steadily increasing in terms of people responding to the census, again, it's going to be so important to keep pushing that messaging out there. Even if you are standing in line 6 feet away from someone at HEB, you can still tell them about the census if you're bored and don't want to look at your phone anymore. Be a census champion. You are getting this education.
Yell it from a distance.
I know, from a distance, keep that 6 feet. But I mean, any place is an opportunity to talk about the census. And again, it's that personal connection from someone that you trust or someone from your community. And again, we just because we're not going to be able to be congregating in spaces, it's going to be really important for all of us to be reminding folks to fill out the census form.
Yeah. And you don't have to be, part of the census count committee to do that. I think that's the best part.
Exactly.
It is incumbent upon all of us to remind our friends and neighbors to get counted because our communities are so important and we can't afford for them to be undercounted. So I think that's an absolutely great point. We're getting to the end of this lesson 2 of Move University. Part of what we're trying to do through this whole series is give folks stuff to read and watch and learn more about. any resources that you want to plug.
The first one being Texas Counts. So we are on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, especially in this period. We've been really ramping up our social media. So if you are interested in learning anything about the census or getting more information, check us out at those handles. But also we have texascounts.org that has lots of really great resources. Something in the works that I am really excited about is I think a lot of people just from this distancing and isolation are trying to find a way to really connect with others.
Yeah.
And so we are putting together kind of a Census Champion 101 course, kind of like what we're doing right now, but basically just giving you the tools you need to feel comfortable and confident to spread the word about the census and the importance of the census and materials and resources to connect people with. And so that is in the works if you're interested in engaging a little bit further in this. And then, like I said, chances are in your community or at your college or university, there is some type of organized complete count effort underway. So I highly encourage you. I mean, just typing in like Austin Travis County CCC, something's going to pop up. So wherever you are, see what's happening on the ground, see how you can potentially support that work or amplify that work in your area.
Awesome. I think that's great. And then we'll be providing more resources on our social today and tomorrow, your after class reading. So make sure that you keep a lookout for that. Katie, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a great conversation. I learned so much. I feel like I'm ready to take my census. I'm going to go open the mail and like go and do it. So thank you so much. And thank you all for watching and for asking questions. If you have any more questions, make sure you tweet us or comment them below and we can come back in after and make sure that we're getting all of those questions answered. But until next time, thank you so much and please wash your hands.